Now let's talk about taking things the other direction and inserting a document back into Couchbase. Along the way, however, as I hope you expect at this point, you need to consider how does the data start? Is this a raw JSON string arriving through a REST API through the browser? And what state do you need to get it into before it goes to Couchbase? So let's talk that through a bit. So how do you go about assigning the metadata to a document? So it's the JSON document class itself that exposes a create method, a static factory method, to create a JSON document. Now the ID and the content itself are required. You can optionally add an expiry value, a time to live value, as well as a check and set, or sometimes also called a compare and swap value, which is how optimistic locking is controlled. We'll talk about that more in a later lesson in this course. The ID and the CAS value, and all of these values, are set as metadata of the JSON document. Now, based on your architecture, you may also choose to persist some of these values within the body of the document itself, and that is how it's done in the lab code, but it is the metadata that is the controlling values. Now, the ID itself is completely arbitrary. It's up to you how you design your IDs, as long as it stays under 256 bytes. A counter ID pattern used to create a global cluster-wide counter and utilize it as part of document IDs is covered in a later lesson in this course. We're also, as I've said, going to be talking about optimistic locking in a later lesson. So one way to go about this would be in a, for example, conversion method like the toJSON document method in your lab code. You might receive the underlying POJO, the representation of the data, inside your own code, and that may include an ID value within it. You could extract that and then convert the underlying entity, the POJO, into a string value. That string can then be converted via the transcoder into a JSON object. And then that object is passed along with the ID that you've extracted from this object or generated in some other manner. How you go about that is up to your own art and science. You pass those values to the create method. In this case, we're modeling also an entity that stores its CAS value within it, as shown in the lab code, and those values become part of the document. And that conversion then returns the document to whatever code needs to pass it along to Couchbase. So let's take a look at how to do that. So to create a document in the bucket, we actually use from Couchbase bucket, from the bucket, the insert method. So you pass to the insert method a document. Again, as I keep saying, could be a JSON document, but there are other classes that also derive from document. And then you may set other constraints, such as a replication constraint, to determine how many additional replicas should be created in Couchbase beyond the original. Now, before you jump to the conclusion that you would always want to create replicas, I do urge you to go consider the best practice documents and blog articles available at couchbase.com on when and whether it's a good idea to create replicas based on Couchbase's own handling of this. It's not the same as other NoSQL solutions. You can also set persistence constraints that control when the creation, the insertion of this new document gets acknowledged. Now, by default, it's acknowledged as soon as it's placed in cache on the node to which the document is inserted. However, you can change that and, for example, set the acknowledgement to happen only when the value has also subsequently been written to disk. If you'd like to review how this architecture works, please go back and take another look at the Essentials of Couchbase NoSQL Technology course, also available here online. You can also set a timeout value here for the request. As we've said, you can set these timeouts granularly. They can also be set globally as you create the cluster reference itself in your code. And then ultimately the insertion returns the document, but with the updated check and set value. Now just keep track of that, file it away. We're going to talk about that more in a later lesson, but keeping track of your CAS value if you need to manage optimistic locking is part of the insert method. So in your code, it could look like this. You have a create method and you pass some local entity type to it, some POJO that you're using to manage the data within your application. You could pass that to a conversion method, such as the one we just looked at on the prior slide, and that's going to give you the document that you're going to pass to Couchbase. So you pass that to the insert method, and as we said, that's going to return a new document, a copy of the inserted document, but with the updated CAS value, the updated check and set value. And then, as we've said, you can capture exceptions of various sorts here, and then that document, again coming back as a JSON document, might need to be converted back into your local representation, back into your local POJO, and so it could get passed back to a reverse conversion so that it returns to the native data state of your particular application. Of course, you could also architect the application around the notion of the document class as well. We're showing this approach because it may help you with blending the use of Couchbase into your existing applications which represent data in other fashions. You will also have a choice to use the query method here and use nickel and use insert statements. We're not going into detail around this here. In later courses and in later iterations of the product, we would focus on this more. So when would an insert throw an exception? Well, as we said for the prior operation for the get, keep track of your timeouts. Ultimately we are dealing with the interwebs and not every request makes it to the other side of the planet successfully. So timeouts are something to keep track of, along with other exceptions as we've seen, like back pressure and request canceled, temp failure, out of memory, general exceptions. But notice there's also a request too big exception here. As you would have learned in the Essentials course, there is a maximum document size in Couchbase. Couchbase limits the document size to 20 megabytes, and so the SDK can report back if you're trying to break the rules. Now in this upcoming lab, you're going to be serializing, transcoding, and inserting a JSON document back into Couchbase. Let's go take a quick look to orient you to this. Now, you're going to be working in Lab 5, but as another illustration of how our lab files are set up, I'm actually going to open Lab 6 here, and I'm opening that instead of Lab Final. You already know Lab Final has all of the code done in it. Well, you may have noticed already that these are staged solution files, and everything you need to do is already done in the next lab. So I'm going to cheat here a bit and go to my create method. And for those who may just be watching this and not wanting to take the time to work through the workbook, just notice what we're doing here. We are taking the POJO, we're passing it to a conversion method that creates the JSON document with the appropriate metadata, and then we're inserting that through the bucket. And then we get back another JSON document, which we're then passing to be converted back to the local type. So the to and from methods are once again part of the story here. You may want to go back and take a look at those as well. Just review the process, because this is an excellent lab in which to look at how data begins as a string and then becomes a POJO and then becomes a JSON object and then becomes a JSON document passed to the server, and then the process is reversed with the updated document with a new check and set value. In the end, you'll go ahead and run the application, recalling that it's running on 4567, and then you'll go to HTTP tool and make a request to localhost 4567 to the customer 360 application, pointing to the customer endpoint for the customer REST API. And then you're going to do a post operation, and you will be dropping in a document that's available within the lab workbook and submitting that to create back here in the browser a copy of the document, but the document now has an initial CAS value set. How and why it's set to 0 initially, we'll talk about in a later lesson. So go ahead and jump to Lab 5 in your workbook and take some time and look at how these processes are moving through the application, adding in the code where necessary to help you solidify your understanding of the conversion processes and how we create and insert a new document. Then we'll see you back for lesson 6.